Today is the 1st of November, 2024. My name is Bea Lewkowicz. I'm the director of the AJR Refugee Voices Archive and the lead on the Holocaust UK Testimony Portal. And we're having another conversation today, with our partner archives. So I'm very happy to welcome Madeline White from the British Library this morning. Good morning, Madeline.
Good morning, Bea. It's lovely to be here.
Madeline, can you just maybe introduce yourself a little bit and tell us what you do at the British Library?
Certainly can. I'm Madeline White. I am the Curator of Oral History at the British Library and the Deputy Director of Oral History Fieldwork Charity National Life Stories.
Great. So you are one of our partners on the Holocaust Testimony UK portal, and you're a very important partner because you have various collections in your archive. So I think maybe we could start by if you could tell us a little bit about the collections and, about the collection history and, so forth. That would be great.
Certainly. So I think our institution is quite interesting, as you say, from that perspective, compared with other institutions whose collections are represented on the portal, because we, as the British Library, have an extensive collection of oral history interviews, not all of which, in fact, a very small number of which were created by us ourselves. And that includes our Holocaust testimony collections. So we have a fair number of different Holocaust testimony collections that comprise what we would refer to as the Holocaust testimony collections at the British Library. I think we've got 4 of those collections listed with you on the portal. And there are also, as well as these 4 what I would call Holocaust testimony collections, and I'll talk more about them in a minute, we also have, because of the nature of the wide-reaching nature of our oral history collections, we have other Holocaust testimonies that appear in non-Holocaust testimony collections, if you like.
Yeah.
So there is one interview which we have also listed on the portal, which is an interview with Dame Stephanie Shirley, who came over to the UK on the Kindertransport.
Yeah.
So in some sense, that interview is a Holocaust testimony, but because of Stephanie Shirley's extensive work as a career as a computer programmer, that interview actually features in our Oral History of British Science collection. And we have several other oral history interview collections in the archive, which are Jewish history collections, which will contain Holocaust testimonies by extension, and those stories will also appear elsewhere in the archive. But in terms of those core Holocaust testimony collections, we have, in fact, we might have five collections.
Tell us their names.
Of course. Yeah. So we have The Living Memory of the Jewish Community, which is a project that was created by National Life Stories, the fieldwork charity, which we still run out of the British Library's Oral History Department today. And that is the earliest collection of testimonies that we have in the British Library, which was conducted from 1988. We also have the interviews created by the Holocaust Survivors Centre in London, a series of interviews recorded between 1993 and 1998, and a few additional ones subsequently, I think, which have been conducted by the centre with people who visit and use the centre regularly.
And is that still ongoing? Sorry, the Survivors?
I don't think it is, not to my knowledge. I think the most recent interview added to that collection was in 2014.
Okay.
We also have Herbert Levy's German Jewish Refugees interviews. That's a small selection of interviews recorded by Herbert Levy, who was himself a German Jewish refugee, about a selection of interviews that he recorded with people who had escaped Nazi Germany. We have the Central British Fund Kindertransport interviews, which were a series of interviews that were recorded with people who had travelled to Britain on the Kindertransport as children, and those interviews were recorded for as research for the book And the Policeman Smiled. 10,000 Children Escaped from Nazi Europe by
Barry Turner. Yeah,
correct. Yes. So we hold the original interviews from that collection too. And the other collection that we have is a particularly interesting one from the portal's point of view, I think, because it is entitled at the British Library. The title of the collection is Testimony Video Interviews with Holocaust Survivors. And that collection is a series of video interviews that were recorded by what was then known as the British Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies, which was itself an affiliate project of the Fortunoff Video Archive. And we've been in conversation with Stephen Narron at the Fortunoff Archive because they also host copies of those interviews at the Fortunoff. And they are therefore in an interesting sort of intersection in terms of how they're represented in the portal, because both both institutions have that collection listed in different ways at their archives.
So Madeline, thank you so much. So does it mean, just to pick up on the last point, for our users, that these particular video interviews will come up through the British Library and through the Fortunoff Archive?
At the moment, yes. We're currently in conversation with Stephen to match up those interviews so that we can make sure that the portal makes it clear that those interviews are the same, so that someone doesn't think that, a user to the portal doesn't think that an interviewee or a particular survivor has given two separate interviews to the British Library and to the Fortunoff, because it is the same video recorded interview at both institutions. So we're working on that sort of behind the scenes so that by the time the portal launches, we can help you link those up in a way that makes sense.
Okay, but anyway, which brings us to the next topic. So at the moment, I think neither the Fortunoff nor the British Library interviews are available online. So if somebody finds an interview on the portal, which, a British Library interview, how would they manage to see it and to access it?
They should, if they find an interview that they're interested in listening to, they should get in touch with us, the oral history curators, or with the British Library's listening and viewing service, and list the interview that they want to listen to, both the name of the interviewee and the collection which it comes from. Because, as I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, we have survivors who have given multiple interviews and testimonies to projects in our collections. So it helps to know exactly which collection you're interested in, and then we will help you access those testimonies on site at the British Library with a listening appointment.
Okay, that's great. But eventually, and I know some of these interviews have already been online, but eventually some of the collection, not all of it, will be also available on your online system. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely, in the future. So it's worth keeping an eye on British Library social media channels and the British Library website for information about interviews being made available online in the future.
Okay, and Madeline, what do you think of all these Holocaust testimonies? How many will be available online? Is it just to get an idea?
It will be a few hundred, one hopes, certainly, because before we've previously had, as you said, a good number, several hundred interviews available online, both from the Living Memory of the Jewish Community collection and the Holocaust Survivors Centre interviews collection, and the recent Unlocking Our Sound Heritage project, which was a national Authory Heritage funded project to digitise at-risk sound recordings across the UK. Has digitised the Herbert Levy interviews and the Central British Fund Kinder Transport interviews.
Right.
And we hope that we will be able to make those available online too in the future. So I would expect somewhere between 200 and 300 interviews to be available online in the future.
Okay. So in the meantime, if somebody finds something on the portal, they'll come to you and maybe
Yes.
be able to listen to the original tape. Eventually that will be online. And just tell us also, all these interviews, apart from the video interviews, are audio interviews. Is that correct?
That is correct. And the video interviews, we have audio copies of at the library. So the Fortunoff have video copies, and we have the video originals, but we are also able to make audio. People are also able to listen to those interviews at the library, if that makes sense.
Okay, and I think that's quite an interesting topic. And as somebody like you, who've really thought about the history of video and testimony archives, how do you think the technology has affected, let's say, the content actually of the interviews, the audio, the video, the different audio technologies, in the various collections? I mean, sorry, it's a big question, but
no, it is a big question, and it's a really interesting one in a wider sense, actually, in the oral history community. Video versus audio oral history, and the development of new technologies, and how does our practice change to accommodate changes in technology and so on. And we are still principally the oral history department at the British Library is still principally an audio archive. That is what we collect. We collect audio material.
Mm-hmm.
And in the UK oral history landscape, people are still, broadly speaking, recording audio files rather than video files. That's not to say video oral history isn't happening, but in terms of general trends. And I think there are a few reasons for that. I mean, from an archival perspective, audio is easier to archive, and video files, as I'm sure you know, Bea, are enormous. And that's just from the archiving perspective, also from the perspective of creating the interviews in the first place, and the technology and the cost of the technology and the resource involved in recording video interviews is much greater often. So there's a sort of general trend there. But I think in some ways Holocaust testimony exists somewhat as an exception to that rule. And I think there are a few different reasons for that. I think it's in no small part due to who records Holocaust testimony, and what their motivations are for doing so, and what they're trying to achieve by doing so. And I think there are probably lots of other reasons for wanting to create visual and video records of survivors speaking that influences the decision of people creating Holocaust testimony archives to use video, in the sense that it is largely about recording a survivor story, as you say, but also creating a visual record of the existence of that person and of the legacy. I suppose what I'm trying to say is, I think the purpose of video takes on an additional meaning in the context of genocide, for example, where having a visual record of survivors has a different value and a different meaning.
Yeah, so you're saying it's almost that the video itself is another layer of testimony in itself. I mean, I think it's a very interesting topic. Also, I think it's to do with the history, where the history of testimony collection comes from. And certainly, from the Shaw Foundation, of course, it came from a film, in a sense, inspired by the film industry. So that's the natural match in some way, in there.
Yes, I think that's true, and the same with the Fortunoff archive, and that being one of the earliest testimony archives in the US, and that set a precedent then for what Holocaust testimony is, which I think also speaks to something else about how Holocaust testimony has developed over time and where it has developed and what that trajectory has looked like and where the influences come from, because a lot of Holocaust testimony is created by survivor organizations or by Holocaust memorial institutions who have got this impetus for recording testimony from a particular background, a particular history, a particular reason for wanting to do it. And a lot of our collections, including, for example, the living memory of the Jewish community, come more from an oral history background, where there is a precedent for recording oral history interviews, and that background therefore influences the medium that people are recording in. So there's something else there about the history of oral history and the history of Holocaust testimony and the point at which they intersect or where they don't.
Yes, because the obvious question I'd use, because your first collection, the living history of the Jewish community, obviously is not a title for and as such Holocaust testimony project. So maybe just tell us about why did they choose this title?
That's a great question. So that project, the living memory of the Jewish community, was the third project that was run by National Life Stories, which was the, as I said, the oral history fieldwork charity that was established by oral historian Paul Thompson in 1987. And the first two projects that National Life Stories ran or initiated were a project on city lives, so the history of the city, and the leaders of national life, so a series of interviews with leading figures in UK life. So you can see that there's no direct vested interest there in the Holocaust from an institutional point of view. The idea for the living memory of the Jewish community came about when Jennifer Wingate suggested to Paul Thompson, initially the idea was to run a project interviewing refugees. So it was a very broad project of thinking about who should National Life Stories record the stories of refugees to the UK as an interesting perspective. That was the initial idea. has then decided that that was too unwieldy to conceptualize into one project or to fund as one project. So then the idea was that it was narrowed down to Jewish refugees in the UK. And again, that wasn't specifically about the Holocaust at that point, but it was narrowed down to that particular community. And that's where the origin of the living memory of the Jewish community comes from as a title. And it was as Jennifer and Paul were working on setting up that project and doing some exploratory research into who those people might be and what that community might be, that they realised that there was an opportunity and a need for a dedicated Holocaust testimony interviewing project. And they attended Elizabeth Maxwell's Remembering for the Future conference in 1958.
Yeah, so it was at that time where...
It was at that time, yeah, when the conversation was sort of starting to happen about needing to ramp up efforts to solidify Holocaust memory in the UK, I suppose, and the decision was made to focus efforts there. However, the collection isn't exclusively Holocaust testimonies. The vast majority of it is, but the collection title reflects what is actually in the collection, which includes a small number of members of the British Jewish community who weren't Holocaust survivors, who were born in the UK, and tell their stories as well of being a part of the British Jewish community. So it's a very interesting collection, that it is, for all intents and purposes, a Holocaust testimony collection, but it is also more than that, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting, because in a way that you could compare to the Fortune Archive in terms of timeline, isn't it, at that time, and how that was conceptualized, and that it was conceptualized on a bigger scale. And I think that's interesting. And I'm thinking also, whether the medium of audio, video, what impact it had actually on the interview and on the importance given to it by the interviewee, and why I'm asking for this, because, in my experience, a lot of survivors and refugees, it's a big moment when they receive the film and share the film with the family. And it somehow makes it more important than the audio, which doesn't mean that's what I'm saying, but the medium of film it gives it sort of gravitas to the survivor and refugee. I don't know whether that's something you...
It's an interesting question, and I don't really know. I suppose we'd have to do some kind of survey to find out what it means. I think it would be interesting to reflect on that, though, from a point of context, because if we are talking, the living memory of the Jewish community started in the late 80s, and at the time there weren't there just wasn't a large number of Holocaust testimony initiatives in the UK. The Imperial War Museum had started doing some interviews, but I don't think had a consistent approach to Holocaust testimonies, particularly until a bit later than that. So it was almost a bit novel at the time to even be interviewing survivors in this way. So I suppose in the 80s and early 90s, there wasn't an option so much for survivors to think, oh, I'd rather have a filmed interview than an audio interview. And I wonder if maybe that, I mean, exactly as you say, I'm not disagreeing with the value of film, but maybe that also influenced some survivors to give a second testimony later to a film project.
Yes, I mean,
that filmed component.
I mean, I guess Shaw Foundation then, started interviewing 95, 96. So it's not that many years after. It's a few years after that. And the wonderful thing is that you'll be able to see in the portal the people who have given repeat interviews, and video and audio, and how that changes. And you said about Imperial War Museum. Yes, we have some of those early Imperial War Museum interviews, obviously, on the portal. And again, very interesting how they were conducted, and how some are very, very long. And you will be able to compare. There's an interview, I think, with Hella Pick, which is 30 hours. So, very, very long. So that brings me to the other question. What is the average time of interviews? I know British Library do some very, very long interviews. Does that apply to the Holocaust testimonies as well?
Well, no, again, it's a really good question. So the interviews that National Life Stories collects now are, as you say, very long, unless it's a particular approach to oral history, which is based in the life story methodology. The idea being that we don't interview people just about one particular event or aspect of their lives, but we conduct extensive audio biographies, if you will, of people's lives, right from when they were born through to the present day. And on average, a National Life Story interview is now currently in the present day somewhere between 8 and 12 hours long.
Amazing.
The living memory of the Jewish community embodies that methodology. That methodology has been part of National Life Stories since its inception. So those interviews are longer, significantly longer than other Holocaust testimony collections at the library and elsewhere, I think. I couldn't give you an exact average of those interviews over time, but something like 4 or 5 hours on average, I would say, which I think is a bit longer than, say, the average Shoah Foundation interview, for example.
Yeah.
That said, there is something very interesting about those interviews, or that particular National Life Stories collection I would like to talk about, which is who does the interviews.
Yeah.
And that collection is an exception to the rest of the National Life Story collections, in that usually, unless we employ interviewers to do our projects for us, so they're paid interviewers, they are highly qualified trained oral historians who do these interviews. But that particular project, the Holocaust Testimony Project, was volunteer-led, or volunteer interviewers that ran that project. And that, I think, has influenced the length of those interviews compared with other National Life Stories interviews, because of who those volunteers were and how they approached conducting those recordings.
So do you think it made them slightly shorter? Because it's quite difficult. Long interviews are actually quite difficult to do.
Yes,
yeah.
I think that's true. And so I think you can see, if you start looking at or start doing some research into the history of that project and what was expected of the interviews, that the life story methodology is absolutely there. That's absolutely what people were expected to do when they went into that interview scenario. And even if you look at some of the interviews themselves, the amount of time that the interview spends focusing on an interviewee's pre-war life, for example, is much more extensive than in other interviews, because the interviewers were trained to spend more time focusing on the detail of what those experiences were, what their day-to-day lives were like, what their hobbies were, what they ate for breakfast, all that kind of stuff. But in terms of the skill of the interviewer to actually implement that in practice, particularly when interviewing a Holocaust survivor who knows they are in the room for a reason, and that is, whatever you ask of them, they know they're there to testify about the Holocaust, and actually being able to negotiate more time spent on the before the Holocaust section of the interview is quite a skilled thing to try and do. So I think they tend to end up being shorter than even perhaps the methodology would have liked them to be in some cases.
So you're saying, obviously, which is important for any project, the impact of the interviewer, and you think it makes a difference whether it's a volunteer interviewer or a trained.
I think that is part of it. Yes. But also, the other interesting thing about that project is who they wanted those volunteer interviewers to be, and why they chose the people that they chose and what they were attempting to do. And that, I think, is a question that someone can ask of any testimony project. Is who are the interviewers, what is their background, why are they being asked to do this interview, and what do they bring to the interview, and how do they shape it from the interviewer's perspective. As those interviewers that were selected for the living memory of the Jewish community were recruited, as I understand it, from the Jewish community. And the idea was, or the thinking behind it was that by recruiting Jewish interviewers to conduct these interviews, they would have a better understanding of what it is the interviewers were talking about, and they would be able to drive the narrative or empathize or sympathize or understand what it is the interviewer was talking about in a different way to someone who was outside the community. It's a classic oral history theory conversation about insiders versus outsiders.
Yeah.
And in practice, it manifests in quite an interesting way, because I think there are some interviews in that collection where you can witness that dynamic at work in quite a strong and constructive way, particularly when interviewees are talking about their religious upbringing or moments of religious observation when they're using particular lexical terms or talking about particular religious items or objects, and the interviewer understands what they're talking about and is able to explain it for the recording, or to ask follow-up questions that someone who doesn't understand those things or doesn't have first-hand experience of those things might not ask. On the other side, again, given the 1980s, early 1990s context of those interviews, it also creates some very interesting moments where the interviewee has expected the interviewer to have a particular level of knowledge about the Holocaust that the interviewers don't have. And I can think of a couple of instances in the interviews in that collection where it manifests in quite an awkward way, because there's one interview where the interviewee is talking about their experiences in Theresienstadt, for example, and the interviewer doesn't know the word Theresienstadt. They don't know what it is that the interviewer is talking about, and it sets the dynamic back. It sets the atmosphere in the interview back, because the interviewer doesn't understand what the interview is talking about, and the interviewer realizes that they're talking to someone who doesn't know what they think they should know. But that is, I think, a reflection of the time period as much as anything else. Because contemporary Holocaust knowledge wasn't what it is now.
I think, what you're talking about, this, it illustrates the complexity of any oral history project, and the history of a Holocaust testimony recording project, which involves, the training of interviewers, the interviewing, the knowledge of the interview, which is so complex and to be explored, by the people who are, and has to be explored by the people who are now watching the interviews, even if it's sometimes difficult to find data about this, because, the user obviously is just going to see the interview rather than have all this metadata available.
Exactly, which is why I'm glad that you're making these recorded conversations, and hopefully also having institutions perhaps write blogs or write more information about the collection, so that users have that context or know where they can go to get more context. Because this is what my PhD thesis was about. This is what I'm trying to encourage now in my position at the library, is for people to really think about context and the influence of context on content when it comes to archived oral history collections, and how the more someone understands the context in which something was created, the better they can understand that content.
Absolutely. I mean, in theory, we should, not only have information on the institution, but have an archive of the methodology, if there is something. And archives have, like Refugee Voices, if somebody asked me, I could put together the trainings for the interviewers, paperwork, even if there isn't a lot, most institutions will have something. And the way that should be represented. I don't know, we're doing it at the moment at the portal, but eventually I think that should be the case. And so what I was going to ask you, from your point of view, because you have this detailed knowledge, when you look through the different collections and the different methodology and the interviewers, what do you think has changed over time? So is it the length? Is it the time spent after the Holocaust? And I would say, as an interviewer myself, it is always a challenge. And I think you're absolutely right, because when you interview a Holocaust survivor, often that's what they want to talk about. So the post-war, the construction of the post-war is quite difficult, because it's not quite clear where you're going as an interviewer. Well, the other thing is, you know exactly what you're doing. So from your point of view, how has this, in the collection of the British Library, how has the methodology changed, and how has the interview evolved, in a sense, over time?
I think I actually think that the collections at the library don't go on long enough to really answer that question exclusively from a British Library perspective, because actually most of our collections, our Holocaust testimony collections, finished sort of by the early 2000s.
Okay.
There are a handful of, I think, as I said, there are a handful of Holocaust survivor centre interviews that were added in the 2000s, but mostly that had finished by the end of the 90s, actually. And the same with the Living Memory of the Jewish Community, that wrapped up largely in the 2000s. So I think our collections are actually quite young Holocaust testimony collections. I think to answer that question, you'd need to look across collections a bit more. But I think there is my feeling is that there has been a trend towards an almost genre of Holocaust testimony that has standardized the format, perhaps not intentionally,
Mm,
but there is now something that people understand Holocaust testimony to be. And I think that includes video largely. I think anyone initiating a Holocaust, or lots of people initiating Holocaust testimony collections today, will think first and foremost to do video
mm,
interviews, but also structure, and how you navigate the sort of the pre-war, wartime, post-war life. I think that kind of tripartite structure in terms of a Holocaust interview
mm.
is fairly solidified, and I don't think that's necessarily something that's happened intentionally. I think that probably also reflects the nature of the event that we're talking about, and the impact of going through an event like a genocide, and how that forces you to structure your own life narrative into a
Yeah.
before, during, and after kind of way of narrating your own life story. But I think, yeah, that trend towards some kind of standardized format is quite an interesting thing, or would be quite an interesting thing for people to reflect on. I don't necessarily can't necessarily comment on that specifically
Yeah.
myself, but I think you're absolutely right to ask the question, and to think about what it is.
Well, again, hopefully the portal will be able to answer that because we can, it the interviews encompass maybe 40, 50 years from, I haven't looked. I think the oldest one is, let's say, in the late 80s to the most recent, which is, yesterday, let's say. So that's quite, that gives us, and for example, you mentioned Dame Stephanie Shirley. So she features, for example, in the Holocaust Memorial Foundation interviews. So immediately you will be eventually online. You'll be able to compare her interview, which is from last, I think it was conducted 2016, to your older interview. And I think that will be really interesting. And I'm thinking, so for example, for me now conducting interviews, so for me it's quite important now to actually talk with each survivor about the sharing of the story and their work in Holocaust
Mhm.
education. So I try to make that a topic. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But I think that's, when people they're at a stage where they have really spoken to schools. I want to know, what did that change for them? What impact did that have? So I think that's another topic now. And
That's a really
maybe,
good. That's a really good point. And I think you've asked me previously to if we've got any examples in the collection of people talking about what testimony means to them.
yeah,
And I went back and tried to have a look to try and find some examples of people sort of at the end of their interview saying why it was important for them to give testimony. But it actually doesn't exist. There are very few examples of survivors talking about that at the end of their interviews in our
mm,
collection. And I mean, there could be lots of reasons why that is, and I mean, there's a whole research project in that, I think, on its
yeah,
own. But one of the reasons I think might be because these testimonies are quite early. The idea of
yeah,
testifying for future generations, or testifying for use in schools, or hadn't necessarily been solidified in such an explicit
yeah,
way that interviewees were able to articulate it, or in such a way that interviewers were even aware that they should ask that question,
yeah,
that it didn't have
exactly.
quite such a cultural significance, Holocaust testimony, that it needed to be included as part of the interview itself.
Yeah.
Whereas now, I think you're absolutely right to ask that question of people you interview, and it's really interesting to hear those responses. But I imagine those motivations are quite different now.
Well, I think, it's a just topic to ask because, people have given a lot of time talking to schools. And now, which is interesting now recently, which has come up for me, is that they have done that, and now since COVID it has stopped. So they haven't
That's
done it
it.
recently, or they
Interesting.
feel, oh, people are not calling us anymore. So it's very interesting. And the other topic, of course, sadly now, is more the current Middle Eastern situation
Mhm.
or Ukrainian war. And that comes in. And as an interviewer, not quite sure, what to do about it. So for me, that's a challenge. I don't know. Should I really, in as an interviewer, is this a good thing? Should one really get involved into this discussion, or is it slightly distracting from it? But of course, if people want to talk about it, it's a valid thing. So I think that will come up in for anyone who is doing current interviews, So to me, it is interesting what in the last 40 years, what sort of cultural things have been picked up and changed. Um, and I think that will come out of the portal.
Can
So
I ask you a question
yeah,
on
of course you
on
can.
this?
Of course you
I'm
can.
going to flip the table now. How much also do you think that's changed because of the age of the people that you're interviewing with regards to how old they were during the Holocaust? Because it must be true. It's true now, right? That the people that you're interviewing will have been very young, likely
Yeah.
have been very young during the Holocaust, because of the time that has expired since the event. And I wonder if that changes one, their motivations to giving testimony, but also that at some point I'm sort of expecting the involvement relationship between survivors and schools and the role of survivors in schools to shift because of the age of the people who are still
Yeah.
alive and able to talk about it. And how does that influence the interview? The fact that the people you're interviewing are much younger.
Absolutely. I think age is, we haven't discussed it yet. It's very, very important. Obviously, if you're interviewed as a 60-year-old or as an 80-year-old, it makes a big difference to how you formulate something, how you remember thing, and of course, in terms of distance to the event. But I think there are two different issues. It's your own memory, and then it's actually the distance to the event. Maybe age, your life stage, I think, is very important. And what I find now is, I think the older people are, the more your memory changes. So I find that you remember the main things, but maybe the details slightly get lost. And that's not, to me, that's not to do with the event. It's to do with the nature of memory. So the traumatic memory stays, and the feeling stays, but the details get less. So for me, I think what we are going to see, if you look across testimony over time, is that sort of change, that the nature of the memory changes, not the essence in a way. That's my feeling. But yeah, I think age is is crucial. Is crucial because I think your current um situation, your current identity, impacts how you remember for sure. And yeah, to me, that's going to be an interesting field of research.
Yeah,
And
I think you're right, and also the point at which um, the projects were initiated as well. I mean, there's definitely some conversation in Holocaust studies or Holocaust historiography about when you interview or why survivors started speaking when they did, or why testimony projects didn't kick off until the late 70s and the early 80s, and how much of it was because people weren't willing to hear or weren't willing to engage, or how much was it because the survivors themselves weren't willing to speak. And
yeah,
also, I think there's something in there also about, as you say, the life trajectory and the point at which someone has slowed down enough to be able to reflect on
yeah.
on their life and then be in a position to talk about it, is interesting.
Yeah, I think, one of the things, again, which challenges the user. I think now when we think of Holocaust testimony, we think of old people. And to me, just, working a little bit with the portal, that you can suddenly access an interview of somebody who's talked, and for example, I take my own father who is in the Shaw Foundation, and suddenly he's there as a 68-year-old, rather than a 90-year-old man. That makes a big difference for the viewer. So I think it changes also how you perceive of somebody and their experiences. So I think it's interesting, and maybe less in audio. Of course, the voice has changed as well, but the visual is so strong, of a younger person. Anyway, there's a lot more to talk about, and hopefully we can do some interesting papers in the future. Madeline, I just wanted to ask you, in terms of anyone who is going to, any potential users, are there any particular interviews which stand out for you, from your own research? Or you've mentioned Stephanie Shirley. Is there anyone else? Um,
um i I don't know.
Sorry, it's a
That's a tricky question, Bea. I
yeah.
was like,
Not
ask
even
you
a
to pick
person.
your favorites. um
Not even a person. It's I don't know, something you want to draw somebody's attention to, or
I think, well, I think I can give a few examples of maybe what I mean when I say that understanding context is important for understanding content, perhaps,
Okay.
and how I think I want to encourage people to think about what a collection is when they're accessing it, so that they can understand what they might find in it a bit better. So one example is, as I say, the life story methodology of the living memory of the Jewish community. If you understand that that's what that collection is doing, you understand that it's a good source of information about people's pre-war lives, because those areas of the interview are much more detailed. So the interviews of Barbara Stimler, for example, I've just published an article on this in the special online edition of the Oral History Journal. It's open access for each download if anyone wants to read it. But I've written an article there which, very briefly and in not a great deal of detail, looks at the multiple interviews that Barbara Stimler gave to different testimony projects over time.
What's her name again? Sorry, because I can't.
Barbara Stimler.
Barbara Stimler. Yep.
And so the first testimony she gave was to the living memory of the Jewish community, and then she subsequently gave interviews to the Shoah Foundation, to the Holocaust Survivor Center, to the Imperial War Museum, and then again to the Imperial War Museum as a video interview for the original Holocaust exhibition.
Okay.
At the IWM. So there's 5 interviews of hers. And looking just at the length of those interviews, you can see how the living memory of the Jewish community interview is much longer. It's about 6.5, 7 hours long, I think, compared to the rest, which average about 2 or 3 hours. I think the Holocaust Survivor Center interview is slightly longer than that, but still much shorter. So in that article in the journal, I look at just briefly how that pre-war area of her life is covered in much more detail in that first interview, and how much more information you get about her education and about her religious upbringing, about the languages that she spoke and why she spoke the languages that she spoke and who taught them to her, and how she was able to use those to move in certain ways in Poland that she wouldn't have been able to do if she spoke different languages, and so on. And so that's a good example of how knowing what you can about a testimony project enables you to look for different information in different types of testimonies. But also to contrast that with, for example, the Holocaust Survivor Center approach to testimony, which is very different to National Life Stories. They received training from National Life Stories, and the projects are connected in certain ways. But the Holocaust Survivor Center approach was much more therapeutic. It was much more about testifying for the experience of testifying, and what benefit that would have to a survivor who was a user of that center and a user of that facility. And that creates an assortment of different kinds of interviews, even within one collection, because you have people who are there who want to be interviewed, who want the interviewer to lead the narrative, to ask the questions, to help them construct their story. But you also have people, like there's an interview, well, I say an interview, it's a recording really, with Fanny Bogdanov, who is really actually just reading. She's reading something that she's written. It's a pre-prepared script. It's her story as she's written it, but then she wanted to narrate it on tape. Right. And that is a whole different type of testimony to a life story interview. But it's equally valid, and but also, if you hear that interview in isolation without, thinking about what that project is and what that collection was trying to achieve, it seems like an odd thing to have allowed someone to do in an interview scenario, because it's not an interview. She's not allowing the interviewer to interview her, but in the context of that project, it was absolutely the right thing for her, and the right thing to have occurred in that moment. So,
well, the good thing is we in Refugee Voices has interviewed Fanny Bogdanov, so there's a really good interview.
There's a really interesting opportunity there to compare that recitation to an interview, and to see what comes up, or how she might refer to the same moments in her life in different ways.
And Barbara's story, what was her story? The one you wrote an article about now.
Do you mean as in what particular?
Was she a survivor, refugee, or?
So she was a survivor of the camps, and came over to the UK afterwards. But it's a really interesting story, and I mean I could talk for forever about that, and I won't.
No. So I mean, people can, somebody wants more information, they can come and, and as you said, if she was interviewed for a different project, maybe it will come up on the portal.
Yes, yeah,
If she
definitely. And
wasn't
there's so
interviewed.
much to say about how, the particular anecdotes from her life are spoken about in the same way across those different interviews. So even though the interviews are, one of them's really long, one of them's really short, there are still moments of her life where she recites the same anecdotes in almost exactly the same fashion. But also how, I give the example of the living memory of the Jewish community being the longer of the interviews because of the methodology, but there are also lots of other things to say about why the interviews get shorter as she goes along. And the fact that she becomes a survivor speaker in schools and therefore gets used to rehearsing her, to recalling her life story in an hour when she's speaking to school children, and how that influences the way that she then approaches an interview. And how she self-edits. I mean, there are moments in some of those later interviews of hers where she is self-editing down her own narrative, and no one is asking her to, but she's used to cutting out bits and moving the story along to deliver it quickly. So she has created this rehearsed narrative that she then keeps giving. It's really interesting to think about.
But it's also, it refers to the, isn't it, the expectation of the interviewee of what an interview is. So, and that's interesting because I often, Refugee Voices interviews are pretty long, normally. So definitely 4 to 5 hours. And often at the end of it, we recently, I get this response, thank you so much for your patience. Patience. We didn't expect it to be that long. So that means the expectation is a shorter thing. And then when we're still there, I think people really appreciate it on the whole, on the whole. But I think what you said is really interesting, that the methodology, of course, does shape the content, and that you can look for different things. The more you know about the context of the project, you can then look for different things. And that's, that hopefully in the portal, the more information we have about the project, then that shapes what we can find, apart from, looking for the search terms and looking for certain things.
Yes, absolutely.
And especially the pre-war thing is more difficult to find through certain search terms. I mean, the portal, the main search term are place of birth, obviously place of interview, and then main experience. So, it will point you to the main experience, but all that other information is much more difficult to find unless you actually engage directly with the interview. Which is a whole other question of how to access all this material collected in interviews. Which obviously is a big thing. And as I said, hopefully the portal is one way into it, but maybe there will be better ways the longer it exists, in fine-tuning how to find more information. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that also speaks to questions about metadata from an archival perspective, and who's created what metadata and how and why, and how easy it therefore is to search within a particular testimony based on what information is searchable about it.
Okay, I think, thank you so much. We got a good sort of overview and engage with some of the topics. But Melly, maybe just to finish, I also know that you interviewed second generations. There is a collection, which we haven't now included on the portal, but can you just tell me a little bit about that and when that
Yeah, there's it's a small number of interviews. I can't remember exactly how many, but it's a handful of interviews which form part of the living memory of the Jewish community collection, and that so the main bulk of the living memory interviews were recorded from 88 until 2000, as I said, and it was about in the 90s when the project had recorded a good number of interviews, and they started to think about what should happen next, or how that collection should be augmented, given, as I say, as it is not just a Holocaust testimony collection, but also about the living memory of the Jewish community in the United Kingdom. So the project then started to conduct interviews with descendants of Holocaust survivors at that point, and I believe that was a decision made in response to a movement in that direction in the US and Israel too, and studies about the intergenerational transmission of trauma that were taking place about that time. So it was kind of in response to developments in Holocaust studies and Holocaust memory more widely.
Mm.
And like I said, I can't remember. It's probably about 20 or so, I think,
Yeah, I've seen
interviews
them.
with
Mm.
second generation members that form part of that collection. But there are some interesting examples there, including, for example, the son of Barbara Stimler is interviewed in that collection, Harvey Stimler, and that's an interesting sort of companion to Stimler's interview, because then you get the opportunity then to think about how he understands his mother's experience
Yeah.
as well as his own experience, and to compares the wrong word, but to explore the relationship between those two stories is quite an interesting opportunity.
Because here's a whole new avenue, and it's interesting that it was done in the 90s, because although of course research has been done, and researchers have interviewed, as far as I know, there are not many public collections of
Interesting.
second and third generation interviews. We Refugee Voices started it, but because there's still so many first generation to be interviewed, we kind of stopped it. We did about 13 or 14. But as far as I know, they're not sort of big public collections. There are researchers and people who've worked on it. So it's quite interesting whether that's going to change in the future. And there's going to be more sort of organized oral history projects, or, I don't
It
know.
is interesting. I mean, also it's a big job. I think once you sort of open that door, the number is enormous. I mean, given the number of survivor testimonies alone, which is enormous.
Yeah, yeah.
The window of
Anyway.
opportunity into second and third generation
Yes, at the moment
is
it's not for the portal, because the portal is really is featuring on of first generation testimony. Okay, Madeline, is there anything else I haven't asked you'd like to add? Anyone who's coming to the collections at the British Library?
I don't think so. I mean, I hope that I've given a good indication of sort of the range of material that we have, and an insight into some of the research opportunities there might be for our material. And I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's absolutely an opportunity for wider exploration of how the Holocaust it finds its way into non-Holocaust related collections. And
Yeah.
with the exception of Stephanie Shirley, we've not done any work to try and include any of those other sort of stories on the portal. So I think there will absolutely be work to do that in the future, not just in the British Library collections, but also more broadly, to be more expansive about our definition of what Holocaust testimony is, and where those stories might exist outside the boundaries of
Yeah.
a Holocaust testimony collection. And it's quite an interesting opportunity, I think.
Yeah. So there's going to be a sort of search across the archives in a way to find refugees or Holocaust survivors who've given testimony for other projects, because maybe what they've done post-war, um, and yeah, and that's probably a bigger search, and then kind of make them available. And the great thing in the portal that we can do that, even if somebody has in their collection just a few voices or a few stories, there's no problem to include them. So I think hopefully we can. So if you find more, obviously you can add them,
Of course.
and other projects as well. So I think that's yeah, that's going to be interesting. But I think, as you said, I think for me, what is really important at the time you collected those stories, and that it was very early, and that's why, in a way, and of course the numbers, there were many interviews, so hopefully many more people will come to you and explore these important interviews, conducted at a specific time
Yes, indeed.
within specific projects. Okay, great. So, Madeline, thank you so much for your time and sharing your knowledge about the British Library interviews, and exploring some of the themes which will come up, hopefully more, and we'll do more workshops and other interesting things to explore the themes relating to Holocaust testimonies and the collection of Holocaust testimonies. So, thank you
Brilliant.
so much.
Pleasure. Thank you, Bea.